Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In the wake of the Wagner Group rebellion in Russia, Faisal Devji discusses the increasing use of contractors and mercenaries within global conflict.
So for 24 hours, we had what appeared to be mayhem in Russia. The Wagner Group, an outfit of mercenaries apparently deployed all over Africa, in parts of the Middle East, and now most recently in Ukraine, turning against, it seemed, the Russian army and possibly even the Russian president, Mr. Putin himself. While these events lasted for a fairly short time, the commentary they generated will, I'm sure, go on for months and months, if not years. Now, much of that commentary, of course, is by Russia specialists, as it should be, and it deals with what happened inside Russia. Are we talking about a kind of St. Petersburg gang in which Putin and Prigozhin are included, and a kind of Moscow gang in which Gerasimov and Shoigu are included? Or are we talking about Putin trying to play off the army against the Wagner Group, or the reverse? Those are questions for Russia specialists. But what I find interesting about what happened in Russia is that it bears a great many resonances globally. That this is not something unique to Russia, that we are seeing something that we have seen before and we shall see again. Now, there are two stories in which what happened in Russia can conventionally be fitted. One has to do with the emergence over very long historical periods of military groups, whether tribal groups or confederacies of some sort, at the edges of empire. And these groups sometimes turn on their own sponsors and take over. Think of the Cossack Rebellion, think in some ways of the Janissaries and the way they were used in the Ottoman Empire. And then there's another story which has to do with the Praetorian Guard. The ruler of an empire creates a special military unit for his own protection, or to be deployed against other forms of military deployment, so as to check one with the other. And here, of course, you have the Praetorian Guards of the Roman emperors and many other kinds of military formations of this kind later. But these two models, I don't think, suffice to account for the comparative nature of what happened in Russia, though they might each play its role. Putin himself, of course, famously mentions in 1917 the Russian Revolution and the role of the Bolshevik Party in it, suggesting that the Bolshevik Party came out of nowhere and took over this revolution. And Prigozhin also mentions 1917 and the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks, of course, can play both these roles as a kind of militarized formation on the borders, or as a kind of not quite Praetorian Guard, but a party structure set up to take power. But I want to move in a slightly different direction here, because I think what's happening and what's very interesting about what's happening is that what you see happening in Russia is the opposition of a centralized bureaucratic structure represented by the army, the Russian army, the kind of organization that characterizes all conventional or old-fashioned nation states, and to some extent even empires, colonial empires. And on the other hand, these, if you will, neoliberal outfits, whether you call them mercenaries or guns for hire, or corporate or groups or companies that are in it ostensibly for the money, but that might make use of nationalist rhetoric and sentiments at the same time. And it's the confusion of the two that I think is so interesting and important here, because the Wagner Group claims to represent, in its brief moment of rebellion, Russian nationalism, the Russian people, the motherland, and indeed the war in Ukraine. Whereas what it should have done is to represent a gun for hire used by the army, which represents national honor, the motherland, etc., etc. So the confusion between the public and the private here really tells us something about the fate of public-private partnerships more generally, which of course become a kind of integral part of neoliberal governance since the 1990s in many different parts of the world, certainly in Western Europe and in North America. So when you look even at the military bit of it more closely, you see that in the United States, for instance, the US Army has been making use of external or outside contractors for years now, and this use has been ramped up enormously since the War on Terror. The problem with a public-private partnership of this kind is that the logic of the top-down centralized bureaucratic structure that characterizes nation states breaks down inevitably when brought into some kind of congruence with these private actors. That happened in the US. It happened famously or infamously in the Abu Ghraib prison, where you have all kinds of abuse of personnel precisely by outside or external contractors, which then reflects very badly on the army, which is seen to have tolerated it or more than tolerated it. Russia, of course, is a different and perhaps more extreme example of this on the battlefield itself. But in both cases, you have the playing out of this struggle between a centralized bureaucratic apparatus and a kind of neoliberal one based on profits. This is not entirely a new story. It's been happening in the military from the 1990s, but of course there is a prehistory to this even before the nation state. Because when you think of colonial rule, often, say with the East India Company, it's a military group, it's also a profit-making company. Now what we see happening in the military sphere, whether in the United States with outside contractors or in Russia with the Wagner Group, you also see playing out in everyday politics as well. When you think about Trumpism in the United States, it too proposes capitalist neoliberal model for politics as a whole. It too targets the centralized top-down bureaucratic structures of the state. So when you have the attempted takeover at the Capitol after Trump loses the elections, it literally is the staging of a revolt against the state and its bureaucratic operations by the people, but the people as defined in neoliberal economic terms. They don't want the bureaucratic structures. They think that they are unfair and they are divisive and they are structured so as to fail the citizenry of the country. But even if you move outside the American obsession with Trump and what he represents, you see this sort of thing acting itself out more generally, including and especially with the army. So if you look at other military mutinies more recently, Turkey's of course looms very large, but before that there was Bangladesh. In both cases you have a military, an army, which represents the bureaucratic state, turning against a populist leader who represents another kind of logic, for whom the bureaucratic state might be an instrument, but actually is an instrument that can also be dispensed with, because the legitimacy of the popular leader comes from elsewhere. And it's often neoliberal, just as with Trump, in its style and its organization. It gathers popularity not through institutions, through social media, through memes, through various kinds of speech acts which do not even necessarily translate into policy or translate into freebies given by a government. So there too you have this interesting situation of the making and coming apart of a public-private partnership at the very heart of the state. It's no longer the case, as in the days of Tony Blair in the UK, where the state actually controlled that partnership and it could be said to happen here, there and elsewhere. Now the partnership seems to have taken over altogether, and you see the consequences of the takeover in countries like Turkey or in Bangladesh, or indeed most recently in Russia and certainly in the United States. Now in all these cases it manifests itself differently. Sometimes it's seen as the state versus the army, sometimes it's seen as a private military player like the Wagner Group against the official army. Sometimes it is a populist leader against an army, or indeed against the people or civil society. But in all these cases, what you're talking about is the a representative of the bureaucratic state on the one side and a representative of neoliberal forms of governance and populist support on the other, for which it is the logic of the market that dominates.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.